Good evening. It's a simple fact. Russia is banned from the 2018 Winter Olympic Games. An unprecedented move by the IOC. It's punishment for what the IOC says is a widespread state-sponsored doping. Russians who can prove that they are clean will be allowed to compete, but not under the Russian flag, in neutral uniforms and without the Russian flag or anthem. They will be athletes of Russian origin. World Sports Don Riddell's in Atlanta. Matthew Chance is in Moscow. We'll be with you, Matthew, in 1 second for reaction. Don, the doping scandal has been around for some time. We've seen action taken before. Why did they decide to take action for this Winter Olympic Games?
Well, Richard, you're referring to what the IOC did or didn't do for the Summer Games in Rio last summer, which was essentially to fudge it. They managed to keep a third of the Russian team outside of Rio, but 2/3 of those Russian athletes did still go and compete. And the IOC faced an absolute backlash of criticism for that decision. What has happened between then and now is that I think the IOC is a little older and a little wiser, but they also have conducted further investigations. They have now more evidence about what the Russians were up to in Sochi in 2014 and before that, and they felt ultimately compelled that they had to make such a damning verdict of the Russian Olympic program and to do something pretty unprecedented. And it is just extraordinary to think that in 2014, the Russians spent $50 billion putting on this event. They topped the medal table in a blaze of glory, but now they're not going to be there. No flag, no anthem, no nothing next year.
Stay exactly where you are, Don. We'll come back for some more analysis in 1 second after I've gone to Matthew in Moscow. Well, I mean, the Russians have always denied that they did this. They've always said it's unfair on the individual athletes. Now there's a full throttle, full-scale ban. What will they do?
That's a great question, because the debate in Russia being had in the media and amongst politicians right now is whether this is so much of a humiliation. The idea of competing in the Olympics without the Russian flag, without the Russian anthem, just being described in that sort of weird way as sort of Olympic athletes from Russia is something that is dividing this country. There are calls for a full boycott by Russia of the Olympic Games, and certainly I've spoken to senior Russian officials in this country, right at the top of the hierarchy, and they've told me that if this ban went badly, I spoke to them a day or so ago, they would consider their future cooperation with the Olympic movement. At the same time, there is another school of thought that is like, well, you know, look, maybe we just ride this out. Remember, these athletes have worked very hard to get where they are, to compete at the highest level. They shouldn't be denied that opportunity.
How many athletes, Don Riddell, are we talking about that might be eligible to be regarded clean enough to be Olympic athletes from Russia?
Well, we just don't know. I mean, in 2010 in Vancouver, 177 Russian athletes went. When they hosted it 3 years ago, it was more than 230. So I guess that's the maximum amount of athletes that might be competing. But we just don't know how many are going to be able to basically meet the requirements and demonstrate that they're clean enough to be able to compete. But as Matthew says, we might be talking about 0 Russian athletes.
Matthew, putting aside for a second this idea of the fairness or unfairness of those athletes who won't be allowed to compete, I mean, a boycott is somewhat pyrrhic in the sense that they're not going anyway officially. So what are you boycotting if your athletes aren't supposed to go, and those that can may not be that many in the first place?
Look, I mean, I guess this has taken a political dimension on. I mean, the Russians have always said that this is collective punishment. Vladimir Putin just last month said that sport was now being used as an instrument in geopolitics to make Russia look bad. He even went so far as to say that the allegations of doping against some of the athletes were being fabricated by the United States as a means of sort of wreaking revenge on Russia for what he described as the imagined Russian interference in the US political process. And so, look, there may well be political consequences after this.
Don, final question to you. If I say 1980 and 1984, you know exactly what I mean. Russia boycotted, well, first the US boycotted Russia over Afghanistan. Then the Russians boycotted Los Angeles. Are we back to that level?
Well, I don't know. I'm not hearing any conversations about that yet. We do live in a very different world today, Richard. But, I mean, I guess we'll have to see. I mean, certainly Russia globally have a lot of power and influence. Certainly in the world of sport, they do as well. So if they choose, I guess they could exert some of that power and influence and bring a couple of other countries along with them on a boycott. But we'll have to wait and see. The one thing we haven't mentioned, Richard, briefly, is, of course, whilst this is humiliating for Russia and Russian sport, just 4 months after this, they get to host the Football World Cup. The 32 best football teams in the world are all going to Russia. Now, when Professor Richard McLaren's report came out, the report which has premeditated the IOC's decision today, he did discover that a number of football players were caught up in all of this. And Vitaly Mutko, who was the former sports minister in Russia and who's now the deputy prime minister and the head of the Russian Football Federation, will, of course, be at the very centre of the FIFA World Cup. And yet today he was named and shamed by the IOC president, Thomas Bach, and it was made very clear that he will not be at all welcome in Pyeongchang next year.
We'll talk more about that as that side develops. Gentlemen, thank you.